One officer, bruised and bound, lay trapped beneath a frozen, abandoned bridge with no way out. No radio, no backup, just a howling wind and the relentless ache of winter. Yet, against all odds, someone came. Not in uniform, not on two legs, but a retired K-9 German Shepherd, once trained to obey, now guided only by instinct and an unshakable loyalty. What happened next is a story that will touch your heart and remind you why dogs never truly give up on us, even when we've been left behind. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe in second chances and heroic dogs, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss another story like this. Now sit back, breathe deep, and let this tale carry you into the cold, where an unexpected warmth was found. The night air in Ash Hollow carried the sharp scent of pine needles and snow, curling in gusts down the frozen hillsides like the breath of some great, sleeping beast. It was early January in the Colorado Highlands, and winter had wrapped the small mountain town in a hushed, unforgiving silence. The stars overhead glinted faintly through heavy clouds, while the moon cast only a dim silver wash across the snow-blanketed land. At the edge of the forest, in a cabin built from rough-hewn logs, an old man sat by the fire. A thick wool blanket covered his lap, and a steaming mug of tea sat forgotten on the table beside him. Earl Whitmore, 72, weathered and quiet, was a kind of man who'd always found more comfort in the company of trees and people. Once a respected park ranger with decades of service behind him, Earl had retired into solitude after the passing of his wife 5 winters ago. His beard had gone white, his knees had stiffened with age, but his mind remained sharp, especially when it came to the woods. Beside him, lying with his head across the braided rug, was Shadow, a 7-year-old German Shepherd. His sable coat gleamed in the firelight, his amber eyes watchful, a scar running down his left shoulder from an old injury. Once a proud K-9 unit deployed along the southern border, Shadow had served with quiet precision until an explosion damaged his leg and left a restless soul struggling to settle. Earl had adopted him from the force, and since then, the two had formed an unspoken bond built on shared silence and mutual respect. That night, however, something was different. Shadow stirred from his place by the fire, lifting his head as if some distant signal had reached him. His ears pricked, muscles tightening beneath his thick winter coat. He stood, moved to the door, and let out a low, impatient whine. "What is it, boy?" Earl murmured, setting his mug down. He stood slowly, his boots creaking on the wooden floor. But before he could lift the latch, Shadow leapt forward and nudged it with his snout, pushing it open just enough to slip through. "Shadow!" Earl called after him, but the dog was already a dark blur, vanishing into the snow-glowing woods outside. The wind pulled at the trees and danced across the icy surface of the old trails. Shadow's paws crunched through hardened drifts as he moved swiftly, guided by something deeper than sight or smell, something instinctual, bone-deep. A mile from the cabin, beyond a thicket of frost-covered pines, stood the Iron Cap Bridge, once a vital crossing for logging trucks and fire crews. It had long since fallen into disrepair. Rusted beams reached out over a narrow ravine where the creek below had dried to a bed of ice-flecked mud and scattered stone. The bridge groaned in the cold as the wind swept through its skeletal structure. Shadow reached the clearing and stopped. The silence here was heavier, a kind of stillness that carried weight. His breath steamed into the dark. Then he heard it, a sound beneath the wind, faint but unmistakably human, a groan. His head snapped toward the source, eyes locked, ears forward. It was coming from beneath the bridge. Across town, just beyond the glowing windows of the Ash Hollow Diner, a different kind of silence had taken hold inside the small, wood-paneled police station near the roundabout. The mood was taut with unease. A phone buzzed unanswered on the corner desk. Deputy Megan Harris, 31, with a tidy ponytail and a reputation for blunt honesty, stood leaning over a map, one gloved finger tracing a line along the border roads. "He should have checked in by now," she said, more to herself than anyone else. She was talking about Noah Carter, a young officer recently assigned to narcotic surveillance in the mountainous region. Noah was 28, clean-shaven, with wind-swept chestnut hair and a crooked smile that came too easily. He'd grown up one town over and joined the force out of a mix of principle and stubbornness. He'd been tracking whispers of a drug ring, following nothing solid yet, just a string of sightings and strange tire tracks. His last message had come in 2 nights ago, and then nothing. Sheriff Clay Dobson, a broad man in his early 60s who had got built on diner biscuits and coffee, sat behind the desk, chewing the cap of a pen. "It's probably nothing," he muttered. Snow might have cut the signal. He went too far into the canyons. Megan shot him a sharp glance. He never misses check-in. Clay exhaled through his nose and rubbed his eyes. "All right, we'll ping his last known location again. Maybe he just got stuck." But there was a tremble in his voice, the kind that came from experience, the kind that had learned not to ignore silences like this. Outside, the street lamps flickered as the wind began to pick up again, whistling through the gaps in windows, stirring leaves frozen stiff against the curb. The storm was moving in, and somewhere out there, beneath the old bridge on Iron Cap Ridge, someone wasn't answering. The snow along the ravine had stopped falling, but the cold deepened in its place, curling in wave beneath the iron bridge like a ghost that had forgotten how to speak. It was here, in the bitter hollow under the decaying span, that Shadow stood rigid, his paws sunk into the icy mud, breath steaming in quick bursts. His amber eyes scanned the darkness beneath the bridge's girders, where that faint whimpering sound had drawn him. A broken shape lay sprawled near the base of a collapsed rock outcrop, barely visible in the shadows, barely breathing. Shadow moved forward, cautious yet determined. His instincts had not failed him. As he approached, the form became clearer. A man, tied, his wrists bound tightly behind his back with thick nylon cord, cutting deep into raw skin. His ankles were knotted as well, legs twisted beneath him. A strip of dirty cloth had been shoved into his mouth and fastened around his head. His dark patrol jacket was torn open at the shoulder, exposing skin mottled with bruises and flecks of dried blood. The man's face was pale and swollen, one eye nearly closed from a blow. A faint exhale of frost escaped his lips, just enough to prove he was alive, but not for long, not in this cold. It was Noah Carter. Shadow crept closer, his snout brushing the young officer's cheek. The human scent was unmistakably familiar, layered now with pain and exhaustion. The dog let out a low whine, then began licking at the side of Noah's face, clearing a patch of frozen blood and stirring the man's consciousness. Noah stirred faintly, his eyelids twitching. The sensation was like drifting toward the surface of a frozen lake. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, but he felt warmth at his side, a breath, a heartbeat. Then the bark. Shadow stepped back and let out a short, sharp bark that rang against the metal beams above. No answer. He barked again, louder, longer, a cry sent into the void. Still nothing but the silence of trees and the distant creak of wind through rusted cables. But Shadow wouldn't stop. Again he barked, pacing in tight circles around Noah's body, tail stiff, posture alert. He pawed at the frozen mud, trying to dig beneath Noah's arm, trying to stir him, to move him, anything. The man groaned again, barely audible, but it was something. His lips trembled around the cloth gag, his chest rising in thin, ragged pulls of air. Shadow whimpered and lay down beside him, pressing his body against Noah's to share warmth. His breath steamed against the young man's jaw, and he licked again gently, persistently. Then he barked once more, sharp and deliberate, his voice echoing outward toward the snow-draped trees beyond the ridge. Far from the ravine, back near the forest edge, Earl Whitmore stood on the porch with a flashlight in one hand and Shadow's leash in the other. His boots were half buried in the snow that had fallen since the dog's disappearance. The old man's beard was white with frost, his breath puffing from between tight lips. "Damn dog," he muttered, worry deep in his chest. "Where'd you run off to?" He hadn't heard a single sound since Shadow bolted through the trees over an hour ago. He'd walked to the woodline and back twice, scanning for paw prints, for any sign, but with the snow packing fresh layers over the trail, it was useless. Earl's knuckles whitened around the flashlight. Something wasn't right. He knew that much. He trudged back inside, shedding snow from his jacket, and picked up the old landline on the kitchen wall. He turned the rotary dial slowly and deliberately. It rang twice before being picked up. "Clara," he said simply, On the other end of the line, Clara Monroe sat at her desk, surrounded by veterinary textbooks, thermal wraps, and a sleepy Australian shepherd curled at her feet. Clara was in her late 60s, with sharp gray eyes and a spine as straight as a flagpole. Once a combat medic with the Air Force, she'd spent her post-military years rescuing and rehabilitating injured dogs, especially those cast aside after service. A training accident years ago had taken her favorite partner, and though she never spoke of it, she carried the loss quietly, like a second name. She sat up straighter at Earl's voice. "It's late. What's wrong?" "It's Shadow." He took off toward Iron Cap, wouldn't stop, wouldn't listen. Something's got him riled. Clara's tone shifted instantly. "How long ago?" "How are?" "Change, maybe more. You checked the bridge?" "I can't make it down the ridge in this snow. I'll meet you at the trailhead in 20. She said, "Bring rope and your flare. If that dog's sounding alarms, someone needs saving." She hung up before Earl could reply. Moments later, she was dressed in a waterproof parka, a headlamp slung over her neck, and her backpack filled with first aid kits and emergency blankets. The Aussie at her feet let out a soft whine. "Not this time, Buck," she said, giving the dog a pat. "This one's for Shadow." Back beneath the bridge, Shadow hadn't stopped barking. Every few minutes, he paused to lick Noah's cheek or paw at the ropes binding him, but his strength alone couldn't cut them. The cold had thickened, settling like a weight across Noah's chest. His breath was a whisper now, his eyes flickering open once more, glazed and unfocused, locking briefly on the shape beside him. For a moment, he didn't recognize the dog, but then the name came, unspoken but present, Shadow. Then darkness again, but Shadow stayed. The hours crawled like shadows under moonlight. Snow fell in slow, tired sheets over the ravine, blanketing the frozen earth, the rusted steel girders, and the bruised body of the young man lying broken below. Noah Carter's breathing had grown faint, the shallow rise and fall of his chest more suggestion than certainty. Frost clung to his eyebrows, and his lips had turned pale blue. Death, silent and patient, waited just beneath the surface of his skin. But Shadow did not yield. The old K9 sable coat was dusted white from the falling snow, his body curled tightly around Noah's side. Heat, sparse as it was, passed between them like an ember fighting the wind. Every so often, Shadow rose to lick the officer's cheek or nudge his shoulder with his nose, as if to remind Noah and himself that this was not the end. At one point, Noah's eyes fluttered open again, finding the loyal form press against him, a steadfast anchor in the freezing void. As the day wore on and the festivities continued around them, Noah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The mission wasn't over. It had just begun. There were still people to heal, wounds to mend, and lives to touch. The mission continued, and Shadow, with Noah by his side, would be there to help see it through. In the weeks that followed, the story of Noah and Shadow continued to ripple through Ash Hollow and beyond. The young boy who had found comfort that day became a regular visitor to Clara's training sessions, slowly opening up and finding joy again, often with Shadow by his side. The training program Noah and Clara had built flourished, with more volunteers joining, and the warehouse becoming a beacon of hope for discarded dogs and a place of healing for people from all walks of life. Noah never returned to narcotics detail. Instead, he found his calling in the warehouse, working with Clara, Earl, and Shadow. He helped train new K9 units, not just teaching the dogs, but also mentoring new handlers, sharing the lessons of trust, patience, and partnership he'd learned the hard way. He often spoke at schools and community centers, not just about that fateful night, but about resilience, about finding your purpose, and about the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. Shadow, now officially recognized as a therapy and search dog, became a constant presence in the town. His days were filled with training sessions, visits to schools and a local care home, and the occasional search mission, always guided by that same unwavering instinct and loyalty that saved Noah. His limp was barely noticeable now, a small reminder of his past strength. Earl Whitmore, no longer truly alone, took on the role of unofficial grandfather to the whole operation, offering wisdom, hot meals, and a place of refuge. Clara's program received funding from grants and community donations, allowing her to expand and take in even more dogs in need. As autumn painted the Colorado highlands in brilliant hues, Noah stood outside the cabin one evening, watching the sun dip behind the peaks. Shadow lay beside him, older now, his muzzle grayer, but his spirit as strong as ever. The dog's amber eyes reflected the last light of day, calm and content. "You know, boy," Noah said softly, placing a hand on Shadow's head, "we didn't just find each other that night under the bridge. We found a way forward. Together." Shadow looked up at him, gave a gentle huff, and rested his head back down, his tail giving a slow wag. Inside, the warm glow of the cabin light spilled onto the porch where Clara sat mending a training harness, and Earl could be heard humming an old tune by the stove. The scent of dinner, cooking drifted through the screen door. Life had taken a turn none of them could have predicted that cold January night. What started with a desperate bark echoing under a frozen bridge had blossomed into a new chapter for everyone involved. They had formed a family, built a purpose, and created a legacy of healing and hope that would endure long after that first snow had melted. The mountains stood sentinel around them, unchanged by the seasons, holding the memories of that harsh winter and the miracle that followed. But down in the valley, in the small town of Ash Hollow, life was good. It was filled with laughter, with new beginnings, and with the simple, profound joy of being truly, deeply, gratefully alive. And in the quiet moments, when the wind picked up and whispered to the pines, Noah swore he could still hear that first sharp bark that had shattered the silence and changed everything. It was a sound he would carry forever, the sound of loyalty, of hope, and of a friend who had never given up.